So I'm going to start the recording. There we go. Just so everyone else knows, we are recording this. So don't do anything weird or say anything untoward while Edward is giving his presentation.
Honestly, you should be warning me of that.
That's right. Well, it was, I wasn't trying to single you out and just kind of pretending like it was a problem for everybody, but no. So yeah, thanks guys for coming. This is Edward. He's wonderful. If you guys haven't seen him out kayaking before, Shed Aquariums, Kayak for Conservation program, these folks come through all the time. And Edward is very gracious in donating some of his time tonight to help us understand a little more about bird watching, the do's and don'ts, the helpful tips, how to look for stuff, what to do if you see a bird. Don't panic. Get your phone out maybe if you have the opportunity. But these are all really good observations for us, especially as we're going into this winter season. And Edward will tell you more about this. We get a bunch of really cool birds coming through, and we really want to capture that as best as we can, gather as much data. It's not going to be 100% accurate or easy for everyone at the beginning, but this is something we hope as you guys do more and more of it, do more and more homework on it, get a little better every time you go out, and eventually you'll be a bird expert. You'll be telling all your friends breathlessly about the black-capped chickadee that you got to see at the Wild Mile today. It was amazing. Something more unusual than that, I'm sure. But Edward, I will let you take it away. I'm also going to make you host here so you can go ahead and share your screen with whatever.
Well, yeah. So hi guys. Thanks for joining me this evening. It's a it's a pretty easy ask to donate my time when it comes to just yakking about birds. It's kind of a thing for me. I think I've sort of become known as the bird guy around Shed, which I don't know where that came from, but I'm rolling with it, right? As Phil said, I do work at Shed Aquarium. If maybe you've seen me around, the last couple of years helping out here and there, either with island builds or running the Kayak for Conservation program that happens out there in the Wild Mile. And then I am also president of Chicago Ornithological Society, which is really just a delightfully long and complicated word to say a club full of bird nerds who, maybe go slightly above and beyond in terms of their bird nerdery and, their conservation, which is, I think, the big reason kind of why this is natural for you guys, because you guys being river rangers, I mean, you are by default conservationists. That's why you do what you do. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here and do presentation mode. Okay, is that full screen for everybody? Cool, got that big fancy slide there. So right off the bat, I want to point out here that whether you have tons of experience or no experience at all or something in the middle, birding and birds and bird ID and stuff, I realize can be really intimidating. It's one of those things where you take a look from the outside in and you're like, holy crap. Not only is that full of just like crazy people who like have the ability to like ID things down to species just from a little cheap, but where do you even begin? How do I get started even just trying to understand what the heck am I looking at here? And so really what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to kind of walk you through what I think are the most important basic steps, right? If you're going to just start learning here and figuring out how do you even tell these dang things apart, these are kind of the key steps and things that you want to look for. We'll walk through that a little, look at some examples of those. And then at the very end here, I'm going to highlight some of the species that are going to be of particular interest for you going into the winter season here. I know Phil mentioned in his email and earlier here that, this is one of the minor activities that you can do year round. Any time of the year that you could potentially be out there, there will be potentially birds to see. And especially when it comes to the Wild Mile and our interest in terms of river ecology and what's benefiting from our work out there, November through December and January is actually a really great time for us because it is a really big time for waterfowl, which obviously is kind of a big priority for us at Urban Rivers and Shed and all in between. Anyway, blah, 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 blah. Let's get into it here. So last time I did this presentation, it was for a bunch of plant nerds, but I figured I'd leave this in here for anybody here who is also a plant person first who might get this joke. It's a little bit, if you're coming in from an amphibian perspective or a plant perspective, it can be a little intimidating. where do we even start? Yeah, sure. I know how to ID birds. That's a bird. Nailed it. There are about 300 different species of birds that are found in the Chicagoland area. And, while that seems like an intimidating number, think about the fact that there's like, what, 3,000 plants in Chicagoland area. So I think this is actually pretty manageable when you think about it in those terms here. Like 300 is not too bad. And you think about the fact that maybe about 100 of those are ones that you're actually going to reasonably see on a regular basis. So really think in terms of, I just need to figure out how do I ID the most regular 100 birds in Chicago, and I'm well on my way to understanding not only birds in general, but their ecology and all kinds of aspects of the natural world. And I get it. Bird ID is simply tough sometimes. I mean, look at these two birds right here. Would you believe that they're completely different species? Completely different. Same kind of general family and group, but those are different birds somehow. Can you tell? This is what they, go forward here. This is what they grew up to look like. And of course you're like, oh boy, all right, here we go. What do I even do with this information? Well, all right. Thankfully, the bird on the left is one that we're actually very familiar with around here. It does very well in the Chicagoland area. And the one on the right never shows up in Chicago. So that's nice, convenient right there. But right off the bat, you can see how I get it. These can be some challenging distinctions to make here. We'll walk through these distinctions here. It's not just a matter of, aha, I'm a bird guy and therefore inherently have secret knowledge that you can never understand. It's all about what we drink, actually. It's, if you drink more of one kind of a beer than another, you become a plant nerd or you become a bird nerd. It depends on what your brew is. But you probably know a lot more about birds than you realize. All right, so feel free to unmute yourself. What is that? What's that bird?
Canada goose.
Yeah, there you go. Canada goose, pretty common. We all know this one. I've heard it referred by many things. It's a bit of a bully bird, very common, cobra chicken, whatever you want to call it. What about this one? Who knows what that bird is?
Plover?
Yeah, exactly. It's a plover. If you guys heard anything about those famous piping plovers in Montrose Beach, that's one of them right there. So there you go. You know what that one is. What about this one?
Pigeon.
Yeah, there you go. Pigeon. No trick to that one. How about this one? I bet y'all know this one.
Owl?
Yeah, it's a snowy owl. And what about that one?
Chickadee.
Ooh, interesting. It stumped a couple of people. That is a sparrow. It's a house sparrow. So, all right. So there you go. Clean sweep almost across the entire board there. And I mean, these are all very different looking birds. I mean, some of them are big, some of them are small, some of them are weird long necks, some of them are different colors, right? But right off the bat here, before you've even gotten into the nitty gritty, you already know how to tell all these birds apart. Maybe it's just because you're used to them by now, you see them all the time, or maybe because you keyed in on something that was subtle and different between them all. But you've already got kind of the basics already in your brain, whether you realize it or not. And really what it breaks down to is these key steps here. Shape, color, pattern, plumage, just what its coloring is. Behavior, habitat, where is it found, calls, vocalizations, and timing. And those are all pretty self-explanatory, but they're all very important pieces to understanding what the heck it is that you're looking at. And they can all help you narrow down what you're getting to. Now, if I were to go through every single one of these in detail and thoroughly, we'd be here all night. So for today's purposes, I'm going to focus primarily on the shape and the color pattern categories, because those are ones that really probably get you the farthest along, especially starting out here trying to tell your birds apart. So, and then when we get to the end, we'll talk a little bit about some resources beyond this that you guys can access to help you along. All right, so shapes. Take a look at these two birds. Forget, they both have white heads. They both kind of have black backs. That's the same bird, right? No.
No.
Why isn't that the same bird? They even got a yellow beak. Somebody was saying something.
I said because one of them is an eagle, but it's probably not the right answer.
I mean, yeah, no, you're absolutely right. The one on the left is a bald eagle. The one on the right is a black-backed gull. But forgetting specifics aside, you pointed out that one's an eagle. Well, yeah, geez, you don't even need to know species. You just know right away, like, geez, you know, there's lots of elements to the shape that are different. It's a hulkier bird. It's got that big, heavy, you know, cooked beak, those feet down there with those sharp claws and talons. Like, that is an eagle. Sometimes you can't describe it. It's a feeling, but that's an eagle. And on the right, we've got this kind of goofy looking bird. It's got those sort of long stilt-like paddle feet, kind of got that sort of heavier but narrow bill. I mean, that is a gull, right? There are literally dozens of different species of gulls in North America, and they're kind of a pain in the ass to tell apart, but you know that is a gull just by looking at the fact that they're completely different shapes. Their colors are very similar. If somebody were to walk up to you and describe, oh, it was a white head with a black back, you could argue it was either one of those. But looking at them, you can really clearly see those are different. This is one that I found on the internet right as COVID started, and I thought it was pretty hilarious. Obviously, the ravens, they're getting their natural color back. But here's the thing. Let's take a look at a real raven. Barring the fact that that is clearly very black and those are very not, what's different about those birds? Forget color. If this was all just kind of grayscale, how can you tell that those birds on the right are clearly not ravens?
They don't have beards.
What was that, Chris?
They don't have beards.
Yeah, no, that's a great one. Yeah. Look how he's got kind of sort of like a throat glottis kind of situation down here, right? You know, the raven is got a much longer, heftier beak, whereas those parakeets over there, they're shorter, stubbier, and curved. You notice the parakeets have very long, narrow tails, but the raven is more kind of a stocky, shorter wedge tail. There's all kinds of hints that you can look at here where you're just like, even if I painted that raven the same colors as those parakeets over there, something would not be right. They would clearly not line up. So a great example is the birds of prey, the raptors, right? Your eagles, your hawks, your falcons. One of the best way, they're a really great group because they're very easy to tell apart just by shape. Oftentimes you'll see them, say, flying high in the sky and the sun will be behind them and all you'll get is a shadow. That's all you'll see. You won't see any colors or anything like that, but you can look at that shape and go, oh, okay, I know what that is. So an example here, right? We've got our eagles. They're huge, very broad wingspans stretching way out there. Hawks, a little bit more kind of stocky looking. They've got the sort of broad wings, but they're not sort of just way out there like boat paddles. There's a group of hawks that are called the accipiters. They hunt small birds like sparrows. They're very common in cities. And they have shorter wings, but really long tails. And you can see how those two hawk groups compare, the buteos and the accipiters. And then, of course, falcons. I mean, the minute you see those pointy wings without any of those kind of fingers that like the hawks and the eagle have, you already right off the bat, you're like, okay, boom, that's a falcon. I don't know which one, but I know that I can narrow that down to falcon. I'm not just looking at any old hunting bird, right? And there are other features too, you know, not just sheer size, but sort of proportions. Is the tail longer than the wings or is the wings shorter? Does it have a really big head compared to its body? That's going to be a feature that we look for as well. Is the beak short and stubby, or is it really heavy and bulky, or is it long and narrow, right? These are kinds of features that you look for as you kind of parse out the shapes and the proportions and the sizes that really help you narrow in what you're looking at. Here's another one right here. Yeah, look at those beaks. That is wonky. On the one hand, we've got down here in the bottom left, Stabby McStabberson here. That is one of the sharpest beaks out there. In fact, there was a recent news article about how a bald eagle chased after one of these and the loon stabbed it through the heart with its beak. That thing is so sharp and pointy and killed the eagle. So yeah, very different beak and function than, say, the red bird over on the right here, which is called a crossbill. I wonder why it's called a crossbill. Very different form, very different function. But if you were to see these two birds next to each other, you would notice, oh, geez, okay, I'm looking at very different kinds of things here. I definitely know those are not the same bird. All right, let's talk about tails. So these are both flycatchers. They're very closely related. They're in the same genus family. But on the left, we have a kingbird. And on the right, we have a scissor-tailed flycatcher. Again, I wonder why it's called that. But this is a dramatic example here. We've got a short kind of squared off tail here versus this dramatic plumed tail. But again, that's a feature you want to look for where you're like, okay, these are clearly different. Does that tail have a notch in it? Does it have maybe like that little white bar at the bottom, or is it completely dark, right? So these are little details in terms of the shape and form and function here that you want to be looking for to really distinguish these birds. You see that fork-tailed flycatcher, you don't even need to see the rest of the bird to know immediately, I know exactly what that is, right? So looking for that form, sometimes even just a glance, is all you need to really get a complete beat and read on what you're looking at. And once you have a good sense of those shapes and the general sort of categories that they fall in, you can kind of start binning every bird into kind of these convenient groups here. So for example, we've got the water birds, right? Your geese, your ducks, your gulls, right? As I say those words, you're probably conjuring images in your head. May not be sort of distinct. You may not have like a species in mind, but you're already imagining like, what does a goose look like? It's kind of a bulky bird with a long neck and paddle feet that floats in the water, right? If I say gull, you probably already conjure right away of an image of kind of generally what that looks like based on its shape. Similarly, birds of prey. If I say a hawk, you probably immediately have an image in your brain based on what you think a general shape of a hawk should be. And then moving on kind of down, you've got the shorebirds, those plovers, those birds that like to run along the beach and chase the waves. You've got woodpeckers, right? Everybody knows what a woodpecker's like. You may not even know what our local woodpeckers are, but you know that shape, that long, narrow, pointy beak, the kind of short tail and the legs that use to prop itself up on a tree, right? And then you get into these other groups you may not be as familiar with, but once you become familiar with them, it becomes really apparent where they belong, right? So you get the flycatchers, swallows. You're probably all very familiar with swallows. You see them swooping around like rockets. On the Wild Mile, we have at least 3 different species on the Wild Mile alone, 4 actually. Wrens, cute little birds that like to hide in the bushes. Thrushes, that's your robins. Robins are a kind of thrush, and all the other birds that look exactly like a robin, but maybe just a different color or size. Warblers and vireos, those are the fun ones for birders. They're very small, generally yellowish birds that migrate through in the spring and the fall and are very colorful and noisy. Sparrows, you're going to see sparrows all year round, no matter where you go, right? But you need to get familiar with them because you need to be able to say, well, geez, there's at least a dozen different sparrow species that can be found in Chicago. Is that at least one of them? And then you can go from there. And similarly, blackbirds, right? Pretty self-explanatory, but they're a totally different group and they've got a totally different sort of shape and vibe and biology to them. So these are kind of what I think very non-formal technical categories here that you can kind of start to sort birds into just simply based on shape that already give you a long way to figuring out what you're looking at. So now let's get into the color a little bit. Color, patterns, plumage, which is a technical term for feathers. This is just the beginner's version of all the different feather names. Every like feather group, little part on them has a name and it's ridiculous. And you don't need to know all that. You really don't need to know all these little technical details and feather groups and whatnot and coverts and wings and you name it. The most important thing is looking at a few key features, areas where birds tend to show their hands, so to speak, right? Areas where the color changes or the patterns really show off who they are. I'm going to go through them. There are 4 key things. The first is wing bars. Take a look at a bird's wings. It's usually one of the first things that you see, right? When it lands somewhere. On the top there, we've got a bird called a Tennessee warbler. And notice how it's a pretty plain bird. It's gray, olive greeny, kind of all across it. There's not much patterning there. And on the bottom there, we've got a bird called a blackpoll warbler. And notice how on its wing, it's got these sort of 2 bars right there, right through the middle of where that wing is. And that's a big dead giveaway, especially right now when a lot of birds are a little harder to tell apart those bars are one of the first things you want to look for to narrow down what that's like. And that's not just in these warblers, that's in a whole bunch of other different groups. Look for patterns on that outside of the wing. Those patterns will give you a big hint as to what you're looking at. The belly and the throat. So these are two species of swallow, one of which we actually get in the wild mile in pretty good numbers, and we know nests there. The top one is a bank swallow. We don't get that one in the wild mile. The bottom one is a rough wing swallow. That's the swallow. That's the one that we do get. And right off the bat, you might think, oh, they're super fast and soupy and brown, right? But take a closer look. You'll notice how the bank swallow kind of has a little collar there, right between the belly and the throat there, nice little kind of necklace. Whereas with the rough wing swallow, it's kind of a more just sort of brown wash across that belly and that throat. And when it comes to these two birds, oftentimes that's the only thing you have to go off of to be able to tell them apart, know which one you're looking at. So looking at those belly markings, those throat markings can be really important because that often is what the only thing that can tell birds apart. That also sometimes is how you can tell males and females apart if you're getting into more details like that. Crowns and masks. So you got to look at the face. That facial recognition is often where it's at. And these are sparrows right here. So there are several different kinds of sparrows that we have in our area, and all of them look pretty darn distinct. But to the untrained eye, they're just small and they're brown. Like that's it. They're small, they're brown, they hop around in a bush, and you have a hard time finding them. But when you start seeing them more, one of the biggest ways to tell the sparrows apart is look at their face. Look at their face like you would any person to be able to identify them. So at the top there, we've got the song sparrow. You can kind of see some nice warm brown kind of facial streaks across the face there. Down on the right, we've got a Savannah sparrow. Looks very brown and similar, but you can kind of see that sort of yellow stripe across the top of the eye. None of the other sparrows really have that. Down on the bottom there, we've got the tree sparrow. And you might think, oh, geez, it kind of has similar-ish sort of rusty stripes across the face there, but there's a little more gray there. And actually that cap on the top is actually kind of like a bright red. And the beak with that one actually is bicolored. The top is dark and the bottom is yellow. So again, you want to be looking at that face. What, kind of face patterning do they have? Does that beak have any kind of color patterning to it? And then lastly, eye rings. It's a very weirdly specific thing, but it's an important thing. A lot of birds will give you a giveaway based on, do they have a ring around their eye? Or is it like sort of a half ring? Some of them will have sort of a half ring on top or none on the bottom, or like a half on top, a half on bottom, and then a gap between them. So in the top there, we've got a bird called a veery, where it does not have, it's a kind of thrush. It's related to the robin. It's in the same genus, but it doesn't have that eye ring. It's pretty just sort of brown and then eyeball. Boink. The bottom there, we've got a wood thrush, which is also a relative of the robin, but notice how there's a very bright white circle around that eyeball there. So again, looking for those eye rings can often be a very telltale sign, and especially when sometimes birds get kind of a little ambiguous, maybe they look really similar to another one. It's always those little signs that'll give you what you need to be able to kind of push your ID over the edge. Okay. Any questions so far about any of those features, things looking out for, shape or color or patterns, any of that? You can unmute or put it in the chat if you do. No? Cool. All right, let's talk about what you need. You don't need anything, but binoculars help. So if you do have access to a pair of binoculars, whether that's through Urban Rivers or your grandma or wherever, the dumpster, I don't care. Binoculars certainly help. Unfortunately, birds are not always conveniently sitting right in front of us, ready to see and question and figure out what they are. Sometimes they're very far away or they're moving constantly, and you need the help of some optics to pin them down. So when you're looking for binoculars, two key things. Every pair of binoculars has two numbers, and those two numbers are really important because if you end up getting a pair of binoculars where these numbers are off, you're going to end up with basically dead weight and wasted money that don't help you at all seeing anything. I'm speaking from personal experience here. I can't tell you the number of early learner pairs of binoculars that I got as a kid where I didn't know what I was doing and I couldn't see jack. I couldn't see things that were right in front of me because the binoculars sucked so bad. So two numbers. The first number is the magnification. That's literally just how far can you see? And they run all over the place. You can get binoculars anywhere from like 4 up to like 20. What you want to them to be useful and functional is somewhere between 7 and 10. That's kind of the sweet spot. If you go any more magnification than 10, you're going to get to a point where it's like trying to point like a laser pointer at a specific spot on the first try every time, and it just doesn't work out. You're not going to be able to see anything. And if you get anything less than that, well, then at that point, I mean, why aren't you just using your naked eye? So if you're looking for magnification, that's the first number. You want something somewhere between 7 and 10. The second number is how wide of a view it is. So again, the sweet spot you want to be looking for is somewhere between 35 and 42. If you find something just outside that range, that's fine too, but that's generally where you want to be. If you're finding something where the field of view is, say, 15, I had a pair like that. Again, it's so narrow, it's like trying to point a laser pointer at something the very first time. You're not going to be able to see what's going on around you, and you can't follow anything. So keep in mind, if you look at any pair, those are the numbers you want to look for. The first one between 7 and 10, and the second one between 35 and 42. And I find that any pairs that fit within kind of in that spectrum, even the cheapest bottom of the line Amazon garbage can still be functional and get you where you need to be. Resources. So obviously this is a nice short and sweet presentation. It doesn't teach you everything here. And as amazing as I am, I'm sure you have lots of questions still and further reading and knowledge to go seek out. So these are the things that I recommend. There are so many resources out there for birds and birding. You could easily get lost digging through kind of what you want to do and what works for you. But these are the ones that I started with. I think they're most functional, and they kind of meet the breadth of people's different learning styles. So as far as physical guides and books go, I'd say the big 3 ones that are good to do are Peterson guide. They do like everything, but the original Peterson is a bird guide, the Peterson bird guide. And then Sibley is kind of like the king of bird illustrations in North America. He's the dude. It's a very different style from what Peterson does. But, you know, if you're looking for a monster comprehensive book with lots of different, you know, stages of a bird's life cycle, you want to go for Sibley. Sibley also does a smaller kind of pocket guide, that works for you. And then Kaufman is another really good guide series. They do a whole bunch of different kinds of guides, but birds, again, are their kind of primary first one and really good guides. They all have their merits. They're all really excellent guides. Again, it kind of just depends on what's your personal style. Do you just like the artwork better? I grew up using Peterson, so I have a soft spot for it. As a semi-advanced birder in my life at this point, I prefer Sibley. It gives you a little bit more detail if you're really interested in really getting into those intricacies. But it isn't all just books. There are apps out there now too. There's Merlin Bird ID, which frankly is the best one out there. Again, there are different apps for different learning styles and different preferences, so try them out and see for yourself. But Merlin is the main one that the majority of people use. It has not only pictures of all the birds you could ever possibly encounter out here, but then it also has a little sort of like dichotomous key of sorts that helps you figure out what you're looking at, largely going through the same steps that we went through here today in this presentation. Just how big was the bird? What kind of shape was it? What color was it? And helps you kind of figure out that process of what you're looking at. Plus, just in the last 2 months ago, I want to say, very recently, they added a new feature that allows you to ID bird calls. So if you're able to get close enough to something and record it on your phone on the app, it can actually help you ID that call. It's not foolproof. It's still a work in progress, but from what little I have used it so far, it's pretty darn good. So just putting that out there. And then the other 2 are Audubon Bird Guide. Merlin and Audubon are both free apps. You can download them right now, no problem. And Sibley, there is a fee associated with that, but if you really love Sibley's illustrations and stuff, it's a great app to have. And then all these websites on the right over here are just online resources. If you want to learn more about any aspect of birds, whether that's, you know, what's in my yard right now, what's in my neighborhood right now, what are people seeing currently, or what is the life history of the crow, or what's the latest buzz in the birder world, or you name it. All of that information can be found there. These are kind of the chief sites that house a lot of that info and are great one-stop shops. And if you're really getting into the technical stuff, Birds of the World is an online bird encyclopedia. So if you want to know everything that is known to science about a specific bird species, you go to Birds of the World. There is a fee associated with it, but honestly, I spent way more on far less useful things. So just putting that out there. And then, of course, on a more local level, local and personal level, there are several organizations that you can look into. Chicago Ornithological, that's my group. We're obviously the premier Chicago group. So if you want to learn more about any opportunities, go on hikes or whatever, we're a great website to go to. Another one is Chicago Audubon, Illinois Ornithological, American Birding Association. They all have great communities, great websites, lots of resources available. And then all of those groups also have Facebook groups, right? So if you want to head on to social media, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, they also have social media where people are just talking about birds, right? What's this bird I saw in my yard? Or what's this cool thing? Or sharing cool news and updates and whatnot. So, and I definitely highly recommend joining Birding Memes. That's where I got many of the images for this presentation, and it's a hoot. Any chuckles for that pun would be muchly appreciated. And then if you want to reach out to me directly, this is my contact info. Chicago Ornithological Society is up there. My personal email. Please feel free to drop me a line. Don't feel weird about just emailing me directly or giving me a shout out on Twitter or whatever. I'm always happy to chat and answer your questions and whatnot. So yeah. Any questions about any of that, resources and things like that? All right, cool.
Perfect.
So let's get into the last portion here. Oh. Bonus seasonal section. Let's talk about ducks, guys. Okay. All right, so duck time. So the funny thing about this is that most people don't realize this. Most people think, oh yeah, bird migration, right? That happens in the spring and the fall, and then like there's some birds around that are like nesting in the summer, and then winter is dead, and that's it, right? Well, here's the thing. The vast majority of ducks in North America don't spend time here. They just pass through on their way north, and they do all their breeding and mating and stuff up in Canada, way north of the boreal forest. We're talking like Arctic Circle freezing, right? During the summer, it's not freezing, so it's great for breeding ducks and waterfowl and such, right? But when the winter does come around and everything freezes over, all of that waterfowl starts making its way south. And the thing about these birds is that they don't need to go to Mexico to be able to survive. They don't need to go that far. They just need to go as far as there is open water. And you know, up in the Hudson Bay, that stuff freezes over pretty consistently every year, solid for weeks and months at a time. So it forces these birds to slowly make their way south. So not only are they kind of late migrants, they tend to kind of just wait to the last minute when things finally start getting cold and don't even start moving until late October, early November. But then they're only going as far as they need to, which conveniently for us, we have these monstrous Great Lakes and lots of waterways around here that except for in the most extreme circumstances, tend to be largely ice-free or at least open water for most of the winter. And so what we see is that come early to mid-November, we're going to start seeing all kinds of waterfowl that we don't see at any other part of the year, spring, summer, or fall. And they're going to be showing up here pretty soon. And so this is really important because while we obviously care about what birds are using the wild mile and the river during the spring and fall when they're migrating and looking for food. And obviously we care during the summer for any birds that are literally nesting there and how they're utilizing our gardens and how they're using the space and how they're being impacted by restoration. Even when our gardens are totally in hibernation for the winter, we're theoretically having an impact on the waterways in terms of fish diversity and other kinds of food diversity and creating habitat which is also useful for these winter birds. So where they go and where they hang out is going to be really important for us to understand. Are we making room for these wintering waterfowl? Are they sticking around in these spaces that we're restoring and caring for? So going back to the bins here, let's talk about the water birds. There are really 4 groups of water birds, as I call them roughly, that you guys should really know or really get to know or start getting to know here as you do your monitoring. And this will be useful all throughout the year, but especially going into these months ahead here, this will be useful species to really kind of get familiar with as you go out and do your monitoring. So first things first, let's talk about geese. This is easy. There's really one goose. It's the Canada goose. We all know it, right? That's the most common, most frequent species in our area. No doubt about it. They're here year round. We do actually see more during the winter because a lot of non-urban geese are flying into the city, A, because waterways, and B, because cities are safe from hunting. But we will find that you're going to see them pretty much wherever you go all year round. The addition to that is we do sometimes get this bird called the snow goose. Again, I really wonder where it got its name from. But the snow goose is a uncommon visitor to our area. It certainly isn't, I wouldn't call it rare, but it is an uncommon one. We get a couple every year that show up in different places. I have yet to see any reports of any in the Wild Mile. There have occasionally been some seen in the North Avenue Turning Basin, but that's a really good one to make sure that you recognize, oh, geez, that is clearly different from a Canada goose, and making sure that we're looking out for that and reporting that. There are a few other very rare geese that sometimes show up in the Chicagoland area. And let's just put it this way, you probably shouldn't worry too much about trying to learn them, right? Because you're probably not going to see them. But if you happen to be out there one day and you see a goose that doesn't look like one of these two, call me immediately. Just saying, because that would be pretty wild. Okay. All right, the herons. Everybody is probably familiar with these birds at this point, right? If you've done any stints in the Wild Mile, you have seen one of 3 of these, if not all 3 of them. These are the 3 most common herons in Chicagoland, and certainly we see all 3 of them in the North Avenue Turning Basin in the Wild Mile. You probably even know these ones by name at this point, but we've got up on the top left the green heron, small little heron, size of about maybe a crow. Down in the middle there, the great blue heron, the big baddie, kind of like a pterodactyl, has a really big croak when it flies. And then at the top right, the Chicago River penguin, also known as the black-crowned night heron. And that's actually a state endangered species. So it's pretty darn awesome that we see as many as we do in the Wild Mile using that space, because we're supporting an endangered species out there. But these 3 species, most of the year can be found here. Green herons will migrate out. They will not be around for the winter. Black-crowned night herons will leave to a certain extent, but the blue herons will be with us all winter long. So again, just making sure that you're familiar with these species. They're very important to know. Additionally, we got this little hanger-on here too, the great egret, which is about the size of the great blue heron, same size and shape, just all white. We do have those in the Chicago area, pretty good numbers during the summer and fall, but they seem to prefer more kind of marshes and wet ponds than the Chicago River. We do occasionally see them out there though, so keep your eyes peeled for that as a species. I saw one in the Turning Basin earlier this summer, so keep your eyes out. They do sometimes show up. All right, gulls. Again, pretty easy. We've got 2 gulls. There are other gulls that are found in the Chicago area, but they're very infrequent. They're very rare. They kind of pop in and leave, and that's the end of it. These are the 2 gulls that you're going to be looking at here in the Wild Mile North Avenue space here. And I don't know if you guys knew, but there are in fact 2. It's not just all gull. On the left, we have the herring gull. This is a larger gull, fairly common. You'll notice that it's got sort of a red spot on its bill there, but otherwise it's pretty typical gull shape, size, color. What you think of when you think of a gull. Compare that with the ring-billed gull on the right. Again, I really wonder where it got its name from. But you'll notice that, again, very similar, typical shape. But the big difference here too is that if you can't necessarily always see that beak, they're very different sizes. The herring gull is almost twice as big as a ring-billed gull, almost. And so you can see this sometimes when you're even out there in the wild mile. If you know kind of the big waste management building out there with the big white roof, if you see them sitting up there, you'll see both of them sitting up there, and you'll notice like, geez, some of them are really big honking gulls and some of them are a little bit smaller. Well, what you're seeing is that species difference. Those herring gulls are a lot bigger and bulkier than your ring-billed gulls. We also see way more ring-billed gulls. I say in general, there's about 10 times as many ring-billed gulls as there are herring gulls at any time. But they are both out there, and you do want to kind of be looking for them both and sort of looking for distinctions. And another note to look for is that you notice a lot of them out there don't have those nice clean gray and white colors. A lot of them have sort of like a mottled brown kind of business going on. That just means that those are young birds. Most gulls require anywhere from 2 to 4 years to reach full adulthood. And so from the year that they're born till their full adulthood, when they have that nice clean gray and white coloring, they have these stages of brown that kind of mixed in with all of that white there. So if you're seeing weird colored gulls, that's what that is. That means they're babies. They're not full adults yet. But still, the big dead ringer is looking at that size. That can really tell you, even if it's like a weird mottly brown looking gull, if it's twice as big as the other ones around it, it's a herring gull. Okay, I didn't really have a name for this category, so I just called them the other guys. But these are 3 other water birds that you are going to see out in the wild mile and in the Turning Basin if you haven't already. So on the left, we've got the double-crested cormorant, just cormorant. It's the only cormorant in our area. It's the only one that ever shows up here. You'll notice that some of them, again, have a bit of a color difference. The top one is like full black with that yellow beak. That's an adult cormorant. And the one down at the bottom there where it's got kind of more like a brown tan look to it, that's just a young bird. That means it was probably born this year or last year and is still working on those adult full black feathers. But they're both cormorants. They're both the same species, and you will see them around a lot. Sometimes you'll see them sitting in a tree, sunning themselves off, like spread their wings, or sometimes you'll see them cruising around in the river and diving after fish. On the right, on the top right, we've got the American coot. Now, the American coot is not a duck. It's not a cormorant. It's related to these birds called rails, but that's a taxonomic rabbit hole we don't want to go down right now. Suffice it to say, they're these kind of small black chicken-shaped birds. If you ever see them standing on land, they've got these ridiculous feet. Look it up. Look up coot feet. Trust me, it's not some weird search thing. Like, look them up. It's funny. And they primarily actually eat crustaceans. So they're out there eating like aquatic invertebrates, crayfish, etc. And I find that there's a couple we see them more of them. And then down there on the bottom right is this bird called the pied-billed grebe. Now, there are several different species of grebe. This is the common one that we find in our area. All the others are pretty darn rare. But we will occasionally see this bird out here. I noticed that they tend to stick around in the wild mile, especially in the fall. I see them most frequently right now. And then they will end up leaving when the weather gets too cold for them. Alrighty. And last but not least, we've got the ducks. All right, and there are so many ducks. I've got 2 slides for them. So brace yourselves. There are dozens of different species of ducks that are found in North America, that are found in the Chicagoland area. But for our purposes, there are about 10 different species that we regularly find in the Chicago River to some extent that we should really be looking for as a good metric for river health. Are they visiting and using our habitat? I don't know. That's a great question. I apologize. I'll put the names in here and share these slides with you guys as well. All right. So top left, we've got everybody's favorite, the mallard. They go out there, they poop on our docks. They're good friends. Pretty common duck. You're going to see them all year round, spring, summer, fall, winter, and pretty much anywhere we go and anywhere we work, we find them. Nothing too special, but you will notice that the adult males have those bright green heads. The females do not have that. So they're very different color patterning, but very similar shape, size. You can tell pretty much right away, like those are all mallards. I'd say the next one in terms of frequency is the one in the middle there. That's a bird called a merganser, a red-breasted merganser. And notice again right away, a very distinctive wonky bird. Long, thin bill. If you actually ever get a close look at their bill is serrated like a saw blade to help them catch fish. Much larger duck. They're a very large raft-like looking duck. They're very long, they're very big. And again, you'll notice the male and the female have a slightly different color palette. The male is the one with that green head. The female is kind of more drab brown. But again, just looking at those two birds, you look at their kind of their shape, their features, you're like, okay, those are clearly the same bird. And that is the red-breasted merganser. It's one of our many mergansers, but is our most common merganser that we see. And we're going to start seeing those in the Turning Basin very soon. One of the things that'll be interesting to see is that we know we get them in the Turning Basin pretty regularly, but I would love to see how many actually make their way into the Wild Mile because they are fisher birds. They prefer deeper water with fish. And so it'll be really interesting to see how many of them make their way into the Wild Mile this winter. Top right, we've got a little bird called a bufflehead. Now this is a tiny duck. He's very small. He's maybe no bigger than say like that green heron. But again, very distinctive, black and white. I mean, you can't miss it. Floats around and usually in small groups of anywhere to 4 to 5 and hangs out with other ducks and will just be floating around in the basin and hopefully again, maybe in the Wild Mile. They do prefer that deeper water, but I would love to be able to see if they make their way into the Wild Mile. All right, on the bottom left, we've got, once again, aptly named redhead. That is the redhead duck and is again another species that we see a lot of during the winter. They really love our harbors. They really love our basins, these sort of nice, secluded, big chunks of water where there's not a lot of wave action, but there's lots of food to go around. And again, that's a diving duck. They like to go after food and look for kind of food and invertebrates and stuff on the bottom of the basin, the bottom of the river. And then on the bottom right, we've got this duck called a scaup, S-C-A-U-P, scaup. And again, is probably one of the most common winter ducks we get. We don't get them in any other time of the year, but during the winter, they show up here in really big numbers and they love hanging out in the Turning Basin. So those 5 right there are like, I'll call them my tier 1 and tier 2 ducks. These are our tier 1 ducks. If we're going to see any ducks in the basin and potentially in the Wild Mile this year, it's going to be these right here. They're going to be there. They're going to show up. We don't know how many. That depends on the weather, but we know they're going to be there. So these are good ones to remember. These are our tier 2 ducks. These are ones that we will probably see, but it's not a guarantee. We may not see them at all, and they generally tend to be in fewer numbers to begin with. So up on the top left there, that's an interesting one. That is the wood duck. So that is a duck that not only, would we be excited to see during the winter, but does stick around in the Chicago area all year round and would be amazing if someday they actually started to nest in the Wild Mile. The kind of habitat that we're trying to create in the Wild Mile is very similar enough to the preferred habitat of wood ducks that I certainly hope someday we'll end up having them nest in the Wild Mile. We're not there yet, but we're heading that way, hopefully. But again, we will sometimes see them in the winter, especially as they congregate when these sort of smaller ponds and local areas tend to freeze over first when it gets cold, but the large river will remain open and unfrozen. They'll tend to congregate in the river. All right, in the middle there, we've got the fabulous headdress of the hooded merganser. So remember, we mentioned a merganser earlier. This is a different merganser species. This is the hooded merganser. And these guys, again, pretty distinctive. They've got that just fan going on back here that they sometimes will lower or raise. But again, they're kind of a small duck. They're pretty, maybe about the size of my head, honestly. And again, very distinctive based on that sort of fan plumage they've got going back there on the back of their head. On the top right, we've got the golden eye, not like the Bond villain. This is a common golden eye. Again, a very common winter duck in our area. For whatever reason, we don't see as much of them though in the river. And I don't really know what the reason for that is, but they are around and they will show up. And again, pretty distinctive. Once you're looking for those individuals with that big white spotch on the front of their face there, you know pretty much right away, okay, I'm looking at a golden eye. And again, it's a very common winter resident. We will see some of them this year. Those bottom two, I really don't know. I don't know if we're going to see any of them at all, but they do occasionally show up, and it's very kind of hit or miss with them because they tend to be more marsh birds. But if marshes get frozen and there's not enough water for them, they will end up getting pushed to rivers like ours. So the one on the left is this bird called a gadwall, Gadwall. I didn't name him. I don't know. But the gadwall is a species that ends up actually showing up in big numbers in our local marshes, but they never seem to show up in the river unless they're really forced to. So it's not a high priority one for you to memorize, but it is one to just kind of be aware of. Like, it looks a little bit different. So if you see a duck that sort of looks like a mallard, but something's not quite right about it, it might be a gadwall. And then last but not least, we've got the blue-winged teal. These cute little guys are tiny. They might be the tiniest ducks you've ever seen. Maybe like 8 inches long at most. Super cute, tiny little guys. We've got kind of a bluish head with that white stripe across the face there. We do occasionally see them during migration in fall and spring in the Churning Basin, and in very rare numbers during the winter as well. So it's not, again, a high priority for you to be like, oh yeah, I need to know that one. But it is possible that we will see them from time to time while we're out here. Okay, any questions about ducks? That's the end of my presentation. So there you go. That takes up the whole hour there. So hopefully you guys feel at least somewhat equipped now to be like, hi, yes, I understand birds. I'm going to go forth and conquer. And more importantly, you know, as you guys are out there collecting info for us and monitoring your monitoring runs, you're able to start collecting some of that more fine data about what kind of species we're seeing out there. And I really do hope that, while, you know, winters have a tendency to sometimes be a little bit cold and miserable, that you find some time to head out there and, you know, take a peek around, because sometimes that data that we have that we're often missing the most of is that winter data when nobody wants to be going out there, but it is just as important and critical. I know I'll be trying to go out there as much as I can, but it takes kind of a river ranger village here to make sure that we're covering all our bases and getting all the best data that we can get.
That's right. Yes, and for anyone that doesn't quite know, I mean, we've had some really cool things happen in the winter in years past. Last year, we just had a ton of those mergansers. It was kind of an interesting year because our canal sort of half froze over basically until where the office is, and then it was open water from the office into the turning basin. So we had this enormous concentration of all these diving birds that we're just finding where there's not any ice, basically. They're just hanging out. And so that's the kind of stuff we're really hoping that you guys capture. I'm going to quickly show anyone who doesn't already know the bird watching data sheet that we've got going. So taking a look here, it's really simple. It's going to be in our bird watching drive. So everything that you need to know is going to be in this drive folder. It's going to be pretty, here's a even location map that we've got going. So here's where we'd like you to stand. A lot of people have been pretty good at this. We've got one section down here at the REI, right at where the dock is, a section at Whole Foods, right, just anywhere, section of the turning basin where you're standing from Cherry Street Bridge. The important thing really here is in all of these is getting consistent. You don't have to schedule yourself. We've got these schedules to make sure that people aren't going there and watching at the same time. But also, this is a pretty flexible activity. And so it's going to be okay for you guys to start when you want and end when you want. Just make sure that you're doing the same thing every time. We kind of have a little more subjective data gathering terms. So it's really just do your best. But the number one thing that we really want is to try to be consistent across all weeks that you're doing it. So even if people are different, the data is still relatively consistent among what you're gathering. So if I can move this, yeah, so the basic parameters we're looking for, you're just going to write down the date. You're going to write down what the weather's like. So temperature, is it raining? Is it cloudy? Is it windy? Especially things like if there's ice on the canal, especially going into the winter, or other things like that. You're just going to mention your location, the time you started there. Each one of these locations, you're going to be looking for 10 minutes, and then just fill in number, the species that as best you can identify them. So sometimes it's just going to be, goose or mallard or pigeon. Maybe you're not that good with pigeons, or maybe you're not that good with the gulls. So just, as specific as you can get, the number of individuals, and then what they were doing. So this is all these detailed notes are great. We really like to see the detailed notes. If something's happening, like there's a big event where you're seeing 20 mergansers like we were last year, paddling around and diving and doing stuff, that's the kind of stuff that we're really interested in knowing. So pretty simple recording mechanism. If you don't see we try to break this up by month, so it's easy to go back and look through. We're every 2-week increments. So this should be updated relatively regularly. You don't have to do this out in the field, but you can. You could always just write things down and come back and put it in. But either way, just try to get these for every day that you're out there. Our office obviously is going to be open for you guys if you do want to come in and collect our data or our common bird identification cheat sheet and binoculars. We've got a good set of binoculars that are free for anyone to use. But the intention here is that Nick and I or anybody else for Urban Rivers will not have to be there in order for you guys to do this, which is very helpful for us in allowing you guys to get flexibility in your time. So again, these shifts are going to be up and available. You don't have to start at the time that the shift says, but do try to do the same time every single week that you're going out there. And then, just, get into our office, take the binoculars, go out to the spots. The whole thing front to back takes about an hour. So with walking time and with the observation time at each one of these, it's about an hour. So it's a pretty easy and pretty cool thing to do, especially as some of these, I get really excited when the raptors start coming through, like Edward was talking about. Sometimes they're just it's really fascinating to watch them. Like this summer, we were out and we watched, I think it was a sharp-shinned hawk come down, smack a sparrow, bring it back up to a tree. And I just sat there in the boat and just was watching this thing eat this sparrow, just right in front of. So crazy stuff like that is always happening. And it's just good to get you guys out there. You'll start to notice more and more stuff as you get better and better at this. So very much a learning process. Don't hesitate to ask questions. Don't hesitate to, get clarification on anything. This is all stuff that we really expect to be tough at first, but then get easier with time. So we really thank you guys for coming and listening to all this. I mean, it really just is, practice, and that'll get you better and better. And that just makes our data better, and it informs us better as to what's going on out there. YouTube channel, it's just going to be Urban Rivers. I'll send all these links to everything in a follow-up email to everyone who's attended both of these sessions. Wednesday night's going to be our in-person session. So if you guys are like, those pictures were great, but I'd like to get out there and see stuff, feel free to come by. It's going to be a lot of the same info, but we'll do some actual looking and peeping and see what we can find out there when we're out there. So great. Thanks, you guys. Thank you, Edward, especially. Your knowledge is amazing and never ceases to entertain. So thank you for explaining that in a way that we can all get. Thanks, y'all, for coming, and I'll see you out there.
I'm sorry, excuse me. One last quick
Yes.
question.
Of course.
Is the Wednesday in-person session required?
No, not at all. This is good. This is this is a good start here, but it's totally up to you if you feel like you want to get some in-person stuff. If not, this is all you'll need.
But just that I'm not available on Wednesday. Can I get that information some other time? Or
It'll be the same information. The only difference is that we'll be like physically out there looking at some examples instead of just the pictures.
okay, gotcha. Thank you.
No problem. Any other questions? That's a good. I didn't ask for question. Any other questions before we go? No, great, cool. All right, I'll stop the recording here.